The cold that December evening felt sharper than usual, as if the city itself knew something unforgivable was about to happen. Snow clung to the sidewalks in thin, tired patches, and the office building glowed with warm lights that promised safety, stability, and livelihoods inside. For most people, Christmas Eve meant heading home early, arms full of gifts and hearts full of relief. But for one man standing alone in the lobby, it meant watching his entire world quietly collapse while everyone else rushed past. Too busy to notice, he held a small cardboard box in his hands, the kind people pretend not to see when they pass someone carrying it out of an office building. Inside were a few framed photos, a cheap desk plant, and a crumpled drawing made with crayons. The drawing showed a stick figure man holding hands with a smaller stick figure girl, a crooked heart drawn above them. On the back, written in messy letters, were the words, "For Daddy, I love you forever." His name was Daniel. He was a single father, and he had just been fired on Christmas Eve. Daniel hadn't always been invisible. Once, years ago, he had been like everyone else in that building full of plans, believing that hard work was enough to protect you from disaster. But life doesn't ask permission before it breaks you. His wife had died suddenly from an illness that came too fast and stayed too long. One hospital room, one unbearable phone call, and suddenly he was alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a future that felt too heavy to carry. From that moment on, Daniel lived in survival mode. Every decision was filtered through one question: will this keep my daughter safe? He took the first stable job he could find, even though it paid less than his qualifications deserved. He worked longer hours, skipped lunches, and volunteered for every unpleasant task no one else wanted. He became the guy who never complained, never called in sick, never said no. His daughter, Lily, became his entire universe. He learned how to braid hair from YouTube videos, memorized bedtime stories, and figured out how to stretch a paycheck until it almost tore. Every morning he awoke before dawn to prepare her school lunch, slipping in little notes with simple messages like "Be brave" or "Daddy is proud of you." Every night, he fell asleep exhausted, but grateful that he had made it through another day without failing her. But gratitude doesn't pay rent, and exhaustion doesn't impress executives. The company Daniel worked for had changed in recent years. New leadership arrived with polished shoes, sharper words, and a hunger for numbers that left no room for nuance. Compassion was replaced by efficiency, loyalty by performance charts. Daniel's department was understaffed, but expectations doubled. He did his best, but there were days when Lily was sick, days when the babysitter canceled, days when life reminded him he was human. He was late a few times. Not reckless late, not careless late, just 10 minutes here, 15 there. Enough to be noticed by people who never had to choose between a meeting and a child with a fever. The warnings came quietly, hidden behind polite emails and brief conversations. Daniel apologized every time, promised to improve, and worked even harder. He skipped sleep. He stopped seeing friends. He told himself it would pass. It didn't. On Christmas Eve, the email arrived asking him to come to the executive floor. He already knew what it meant. His stomach sank as he rode the elevator upward, the numbers lighting up one by one like a countdown to something final. He thought of Lily waiting at home with a paper Christmas tree taped to the wall, of the small wrapped gift he had bought her with money he couldn't really spare. The meeting was short, too short. Words like policy, attendance, and standards floated through the air, cold and impersonal. No one asked about his daughter. No one mentioned the overtime he'd worked or the projects he'd saved. The decision had already been made. By the time Daniel stepped back into the lobby, box in hand, Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. He stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old that Santa might be late this year because Daddy lost his job. Upstairs, in the top floor office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the CEO watched the city below. His name was Richard. He was successful, respected, and deeply lonely, though few people knew that. His life was built on achievements, mergers, and quarterly victories. But something in him always felt hollow. He told himself that was the price of success. Richard prided himself on being fair, not kind. In his mind, kindness made people weak. Rules kept businesses alive. He had signed off on Daniel's termination without a second thought. To him, it was just another name on a list. But that night, something unusual happened. As Richard prepared to leave early for the first time in years, he noticed something on his desk that hadn't been there before. A thin envelope, slightly bent, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small drawing. The paper wasn't an official document. It wasn't a complaint. It was a letter, written in careful, uneven handwriting. It explained that Daniel had been fired that evening. It explained that he was a single father. It explained that his daughter had drawn pictures for everyone in his office as Christmas gifts, but he never got the chance to hand them out because he was called into the meeting instead. The drawing attached showed a tall building with many windows. At the bottom stood a little girl holding her dad's hand. Above the building were the words, "Thank you for taking care of my daddy so he can take care of me." Richard stared at the page longer than he meant to. Something tightened in his chest. He told himself it was sentimentality, nothing more. But when he stood up, his legs felt heavy. When he reached for his coat, his hands shook. He remembered something he hadn't thought about in decades. A small kitchen, a tired mother working 2 jobs, himself, waiting by the window as a child, hoping his father would come home before dark, hoping he wouldn't lose another job. He sat back down. For the first time in years, Richard opened the employee file again, not as a checklist, but as a story. He saw the overtime logs, the performance reviews, the notes from supervisors praising Daniel's dedication. He saw the attendance marks too, but now they looked different. They looked human. A wave of shame rolled through him, sudden and overwhelming. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing people. He had turned livelihoods into numbers, families into footnotes. And on Christmas Eve, of all days, he had taken a father's stability away. Richard's composure cracked. The man who never raised his voice, never showed weakness, felt tears blur his vision. He pressed his palm against his face and broke down alone in his office. The city lights watching silently, downstairs. Daniel walked home through the cold, his breath visible in the air. Every step felt heavier than the last. He rehearsed the conversation he would have with Lily, wondering how much truth a child could handle. He wondered how long their savings would last. He wondered if he had failed her. When he opened the apartment door, Lily ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. She showed him the paper snowflakes she had made and the cookies she had helped bake with the neighbor. Daniel smiled, even though it hurt, and held her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and crayons. That night, after Lily fell asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt truly afraid, not for himself but for the little girl in the next room who trusted him with everything. The next morning, Christmas Day, the phone rang. Daniel almost didn't answer it, but he did. The voice on the other end was different from what he expected. It wasn't cold, it wasn't rushed, it was unsteady. Richard introduced himself and paused, as if choosing his words carefully. He apologized. Not a corporate apology, not one wrapped in excuses, but a real one. He admitted he had been wrong. He admitted he had forgotten what leadership meant. Richard asked Daniel to come in, not to be rehired under the same conditions, but to talk. Hours later, Daniel sat across from the CEO in the same office where his fate had been sealed. This time, the room felt different, softer, human. Richard offered him his job back, with flexibility, better support, and a raise. But more than that, he offered something unexpected, a chance to help redesign company policies, to support parents, caregivers, and people whose lives didn't fit neatly into spreadsheets. Daniel listened quietly, stunned. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt relieved, grateful. Seen. Over the months that followed, the company changed. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Flexible schedules were introduced. Emergency leave became a right, not a favor. Managers were trained to see people, not just productivity. And Richard changed too. He started leaving the office earlier. He started mentoring instead of commanding. He found purpose not in control, but in impact. The emptiness he'd carried for so long began to fade, replaced by something warmer and unfamiliar, meaning Daniel thrived, not just professionally, but personally. He slept better. He smiled more. Lily noticed the difference. She noticed that Daddy laughed again. Years later, on another winter evening, Daniel stood in that same lobby, this time holding Lily's hand as they attended a company holiday event. The building no longer felt cold, it felt alive. Richard watched them from across the room, his eyes lingering on the little girl, who had unknowingly changed his life with a simple drawing. Sometimes redemption doesn't come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from being